Welcome back. So we have discussed k-means clustering, a clustering algorithm where we have a number of x variables. We indicate how many clusters we think are in the data or we would like to detect in the data. And then the algorithm will tell us where, if there are that many clusters, where is the likely center of those clusters and to which cluster does each of the observations belong. Now the big downside, of course, is to have to decide on k, on the number of clusters. Because if we just have a random data set, how do we know how many clusters to find? We can try different numbers and see whether results improve or disapprove. It's exactly what we will do in the lab. But there is another approach, and this is called hierarchical clustering. And the basic idea of hierarchical clustering, and there's many variations in how this is done, many algorithms, but I just want you to understand the basic principle. Instead of saying we want k clusters, we basically do it in steps. We first divide the entire space in 2 clusters, and then within those clusters, we might find 2 more clusters, and within each of those 2 clusters, we find 2 more clusters, etc. All the way until each cluster is just 1 observation. So, and the algorithm, as I said, there are different algorithms to do the same thing. So sometimes they go top down, where you first split the data in 2, and then the next in 2, and the next in 2, etc. Sometimes it goes bottom up, where you have individual observations and you pair them with the ones that is nearest to it, closest to it, and then you take the next pair that has a really close distance, etc. So you might start at the bottom end of this, so all kind of small clusters that then group and group and group and group into one until you reach one big cluster with all observations. So we get many types of clusters at many different levels, and we get a whole tree of clusters. And we can visualize this hierarchy, this clustering, and that's called the dendrogram. Dendro stands for fingers, I think. So it looks a bit like many fingers. Yeah? So at the top end, we can see that this is the whole data set. Yeah? And these are all the different observations. And observations that are together in one small group, they are very close to each other. Whereas observations that are, for example, this observation from this observation, they're very far from each other. So we can see that there's a cluster here, there's a cluster here, there's a cluster here, there's a cluster here. So we have clusters which are just pairs, right? Just, you see a lot of pairs here. And then there's some that can be grouped a little bit wider category together. And then these also have something in common that is different from, for example, these. And then all of these have something in common that is different from these 2 here. Right? And all of these have something in common that is different from this one. So in the end, everything is just one cluster, one group, which can be split in 2, which each can be split in 2, which each can be split in 2, etc. If you really wanted to have a fixed number of clusters, you can always decide to cut it off, so to speak. So we could cut it here, for example, like this, and we end up with 3 clusters. 1, 2, and 3. Yeah? So we have 3 groups if we cut at that level. A little bit like pruning the tree in the tree analysis. We can also cut here. Yeah? There's a not very horizontal line, it was meant to be horizontal. But you will find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Many more clusters. Yeah? So it depends how low you want to go, how many. So this is comparable to k. This is k as 3, this is k as 8 or something. And depending on how low you go down this ladder, how many groups you have. Yeah? So the more groups, the lower you get. But you can also just look at the dendrogram to get a better understanding. Without actually clustering in specific groups, you can look at the dendrogram to understand the nature of the clustering in the data. Now, one complication here that I don't want you to worry about too much, but when you do hierarchical clustering analysis, you do want to experiment with varying these a little bit to see how sensitive your results are to whatever algorithm you choose. I already said there is this top-down and bottom-up versions. There's another problem that is a little bit complicated in hierarchical clustering. How do you decide on the distance between 2 groups, 2 clusters? So we have, for example, a group of observations here and a group of observations here. And this is the distance between them, is based on the distance. But how was that distance measured? How do we know what the distance is between this group and this group of points? And there's a few different variations on that. One is to take the closest point of this group to the closest point of this group and look at the distance between those points. So whichever point in this cluster is closest to any of the points in this cluster, and whichever point of the point in this cluster is closest to any of the points in this cluster, they will determine the distance. Yeah? The alternative would be the opposite, the longest distance. Whichever of these points is farthest away from any of these points, and whichever of these points is farthest away from any of these points, that will determine the distance between the two clusters. And the third thing we can do is to take the distances between each of these points to each of these points and sort of take the average. So in the slides, I outline these three methods. Single linkage refers to the smallest distance between any 2 points in the 2 clusters. So we take the distance between 2 groups of points as the distance between the point in group 1 that is closest to group 2 and the point in group 2 that is closest to group 1. Complete linkage is the opposite. It's the distance, the largest distance between any of the 2 points. Yeah, so we take the point in group 1 that is furthest from all the points in group 2, and the point in group 2 that is furthest from all the points in group 1, and we take them as the distance. And finally, there's group average. You take all the pairs of all the points in both clusters, and you average the distance. Now, if there is real strong clustering in the data, results are not going to differ much. But if the clustering is moderate or varies, then the results can be quite different depending on the algorithm. So it's good to just try the different specifications and see what kind of effect that has.